October 3rd, 1942. 11:23 a.m. Cairo, Egypt. Staff Sergeant Harry Whitmore stood in the sweltering mail sorting room of the British Army Postal Service depot, staring at what should have been a routine canvas sack of military correspondence. The room smelled of dust, ink, and the faint chemical tang of gum arabic from thousands of stamps. Outside, the midday heat turned the streets into shimmering rivers of light. But inside this converted warehouse, Harry felt cold despite the temperature. In his hands, he held 2 bundles of routing orders. Each bundle contained reassignment instructions for an entire infantry battalion, 800 men who were supposed to be moving to new positions in preparation for the upcoming offensive. The left bundle was stamped with a purple routing mark, reading Malta Forward Base, MFB 7. The right bundle bore a red stamp, reading Alexandria Staging Area, ASA 12. These weren't suggestions. They were movement orders that would put men on trucks, ships, and trains within 48 hours. Harry had been a postman in Manchester before the war. For 12 years, he'd delivered letters through rain, snow, and fog, never losing a single piece of mail. He knew routes, sorting systems, and the absolute importance of getting things to the right place. That skill had made him valuable to the Army, which desperately needed competent postal clerks to manage the millions of letters, orders, and documents flowing through North Africa, as British forces prepared for what would become the Second Battle of El Alamein. But right now, Harry wasn't sure which bundle was which. The problem had started 20 minutes ago when a clerk had knocked over a sorting bin, scattering stamps across 3 tables. In the chaos of gathering them up, 2 different routing stamps, nearly identical in size and shape, had been placed back in the wrong trays. Harry had used them both before noticing the error. Now he stood holding orders for the 2nd Battalion, the Royal Sussex Regiment, and couldn't definitively say whether he'd stamped them for Malta or Alexandria. The difference wasn't academic. Malta was 1,000 miles across the Mediterranean, a besieged island fortress that was critically short of supplies and men. Alexandria was 120 miles up the coast, the staging area for Montgomery's planned offensive at El Alamein. Sending 800 men to the wrong location wouldn't just be embarrassing. It could be catastrophic. Units at Malta were counting on reinforcements that might never arrive. Units at El Alamein might find themselves under strength at the crucial moment. And if Harry reported the error, the entire postal system would have to shut down while every piece of mail sent in the last hour was manually verified. That meant delaying orders, movement schedules, intelligence reports, everything. In the middle of preparing for the largest British offensive of the North African campaign, Corporal Dennis Mackay, Harry's assistant, walked over carrying another bundle of mail. "Sarge, we've got the next batch ready for routing. You all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Harry stared at the 2 bundles in his hands. He could report this. He should report this. But he also knew what would happen. He'd be disciplined, possibly court-martialed for negligence. The mail system would grind to a halt, and 800 men would sit in Cairo while officers tried to figure out where they were supposed to go. Or he could make his best guess. He'd been doing this job for 6 months. He knew the routing protocols. He knew which units were going where. He was 90% sure, maybe 95%, that the bundle in his left hand was the one that should go to Alexandria. The stamp looked slightly darker, which matched the red ink that was running low this week. But 90% sure wasn't 100% sure. And the cost of being wrong was measured in human lives. Harry made a decision that would haunt him for the next 6 weeks and inadvertently change the outcome of one of the most important battles of World War II. He handed the left bundle to Mackay. Alexandria staging area. Standard routing. 3-day priority. Mackay took the bundle without question and walked away. Harry stood alone, holding the right bundle, looking at the stamp that might say Malta or might say Alexandria, and praying he'd made the right choice. He hadn't. The road to catastrophe is often paved with reasonable decisions made under pressure by competent people who simply didn't have enough information. Harry Whitmore was one of those people. And over the next 48 hours, his mistake would set in motion a chain of events that military historians would later call one of the most consequential administrative errors of the North African campaign. Harry Whitmore was born in 1911 in Salford, just outside Manchester, to a family that had worked in the cotton mills for 3 generations. His father, Thomas, was a mill supervisor. His mother, Ellen, took in sewing. Harry was the second of 4 children, quiet, methodical, and cursed with what his teachers called an overdeveloped sense of responsibility. At age 14, he left school to work as a messenger boy for the Manchester Post Office. By age 19, he was a full postman with his own route through Ancoats and Miles Platting, working-class neighborhoods where people depended on the mail for everything from pension checks to letters from relatives abroad. Harry loved the work. There was something deeply satisfying about the order of it. The sorting, the routing, the delivery. Every letter had a destination. Every destination had a route. If you learned the system and paid attention to details, nothing went wrong. Harry prided himself on never losing mail, never delivering to the wrong address, never failing to complete his route. When war came in 1939, Harry was 28 years old, married to his wife Margaret, with a 2-year-old daughter named Claire. He enlisted in early 1940, expecting to fight. Instead, the Army looked at his postal experience and assigned him to the Royal Army Postal Corps. Harry was disappointed at first. He wanted to serve, to fight, to do something important. But his commanding officer, Major George Hensley, explained it differently. Whitmore, an army without mail is an army without morale. Men need letters from home. They need to know their families are safe. They need orders delivered accurately and on time. You think that's not important? Try commanding soldiers who haven't heard from their wives in 3 months. Try running an offensive when half your orders get lost in transit. The Postal Service isn't glamorous, but it's absolutely critical. You'll do more good here than carrying a rifle. Harry accepted the assignment and threw himself into it with the same methodical care he'd given his Manchester route. He learned military postal protocols, routing codes, security classifications, and the chaos of managing mail for an army that was constantly moving. By 1942, he'd been promoted to staff sergeant and sent to Cairo to help manage the massive flow of correspondence supporting British forces in North Africa. Cairo in 1942 was a city of contradictions. Ancient and modern, colonial and independent, beautiful and squalid. The British Army Postal Service operated out of a converted warehouse near the Nile, a cavernous space filled with sorting tables, mail bags, and the constant noise of clerks shouting destinations, typewriters clacking, and trucks arriving with new deliveries. The heat was brutal, the dust was everywhere, and the workload was relentless. Harry supervised a team of 12 clerks sorting and routing thousands of pieces of mail daily. Most of it was personal letters, but mixed in were official documents, movement orders, intelligence reports, supply requisitions, personnel transfers. Everything had to be stamped with routing codes, indicating where it should go next. The system relied on colored stamps, each color corresponding to a different destination or priority level. Red for Alexandria, purple for Malta, blue for Tobruk, green for forward units, yellow for headquarters. The stamps were simple wooden blocks with rubber faces, inked from pads that sat on each sorting table. Clerks grabbed the appropriate stamp, pressed it onto the document, and moved on to the next piece. In a busy depot, a clerk might stamp 500 documents in an hour. The system worked because everyone followed protocol. Verify the destination, grab the correct stamp, apply it clearly, move on. But the system had a vulnerability that nobody had really considered. The stamps looked similar. Same size, same shape, same basic design. The only difference was the color of the ink and the text on the face. If you were tired, if you were rushed, if the lighting was bad, it was possible to grab the wrong stamp. Not likely, but possible. On October 3rd, that possibility became reality. The morning had started normally. Harry arrived at 0630 hours, checked the overnight deliveries, and briefed his team on the day's priorities. A major offensive was being planned. Everyone knew that, which meant movement orders would be coming through in volume. Units were being repositioned, supplies redirected, reinforcements allocated. The entire British Eighth Army was reorganizing under General Bernard Montgomery, and every change generated paperwork that had to be routed correctly. By mid-morning, the depot was processing peak volume. Clerks worked at full speed, sorting mail into bins designated for different destinations. Harry moved between tables, checking work, answering questions, keeping the flow moving. It was organized chaos, and Harry was good at managing it. At 11:03 hours, Corporal Dennis Mackay, a 22-year-old from Glasgow, who'd been working postal duty for 8 months, reached across his table for a fresh stamp pad. His elbow caught the edge of a sorting bin that someone had left too close to the edge. The bin tipped, spilling its contents, 24 rubber stamps, across 3 adjacent tables. Mackay swore and immediately started gathering them up. Other clerks helped. Within 2 minutes, all the stamps had been retrieved and placed back in their appropriate trays. Or so everyone assumed. What nobody noticed was that 2 stamps, the purple Malta Forward Base MFB7 and the red Alexandria Staging Area ASA 12, had been picked up by different clerks and placed in swapped positions. The Malta stamp ended up in the Alexandria tray. The Alexandria stamp ended up in the Malta tray. Harry heard the commotion and came over to check. "Everything all right?" "Aye, Sarge," Mackay said. "Just knocked over the stamp bin. Got them all sorted back." Harry glanced at the tables. Everything looked fine. "Be more careful. We can't afford mistakes right now." "Yes, Sarge." Harry moved on to the next table, The swapped stamps sat in their wrong trays, waiting. 20 minutes later, Harry was processing a batch of high-priority movement orders. The documents had come down from 8th Army headquarters that morning, marked "Immediate execution required." They were reassignment orders for multiple battalions being moved into position for the upcoming offensive. Each document specified the unit, the destination, and the timeline. Harry worked through them methodically. The 1st Battalion, the King's Royal Rifle Corps, was being sent to Tobruk. He stamped it blue. The 3rd Battalion, the Durham Light Infantry, was going to Alexandria for staging. He reached for the red stamp in the Alexandria tray, not knowing it was actually the purple Malta stamp, and pressed it onto the document. He didn't look closely at the impression. He'd stamped thousands of documents. His muscle memory was reliable. Or it had been. He continued through the stack. The 2nd Battalion, the Royal Sussex Regiment, 800 men who were critical reinforcements for the Alamein offensive, were also going to Alexandria. He reached for the Alexandria stamp again, pressed it onto the orders, and moved on. The stamps looked right. The impressions looked right. Harry had no reason to think anything was wrong until 15 minutes later, when he picked up a document designated for Malta and reached for the purple stamp in the Malta tray. He pressed it onto the paper, glanced at the impression, and froze. The stamp said, "Alexandria Staging Area A, SA-12, in red ink. Harry's stomach dropped. He looked at the tray. He looked at the stamp in his hand. He set it down carefully and walked quickly to the Alexandria tray. He picked up the stamp there and examined it. Malta Forward Base MFB-7 in purple ink. The stamps had been swapped, and he'd been using them for the last 20 minutes. Harry's mind raced. How many documents had he stamped? Which ones were which? He tried to remember the sequence, but it was a blur. He stamped dozens of documents every hour. They all blended together. He looked at the outgoing mail bins where stamped documents were placed for routing. Some had already been collected by runners and taken to the loading docks. He grabbed the remaining documents from the outgoing bin and started checking them. 3 were stamped correctly. 2 were stamped incorrectly, orders meant for Alexandria, stamped with the Malta code, and 1 meant for Malta, stamped with the Alexandria code. But there were gaps in the sequence numbers. That meant more documents had already left the depot. Harry felt panic rising but forced himself to think. He could report this immediately. Sound the alarm, halt all outgoing mail, track down every document that had been stamped in the last 20 minutes, and verify each one. It would cause chaos, delays, and he'd likely face serious consequences for the error. But it was the right thing to do. But Harry also knew what that would mean practically. The offensive was days away. Units were moving into position on tight schedules. Halting the mail system could delay critical orders, disrupt supply chains, and potentially compromise the entire operation. And there was another consideration. If he reported the error, he'd be admitting negligence. Court-martial was a real possibility. His career would be over. His family, Margaret and Claire back in Manchester, depended on his army pay. Harry stood at the sorting table, holding the 2 swapped stamps, feeling the weight of the decision crushing down on him. Report it or fix it. Follow protocol or try to contain the damage himself. He looked at the documents still in the outgoing bin. Two were definitely wrong. If he could identify which units had been misrouted, he could send corrective orders. The system had redundancies. Units didn't move based solely on postal routing stamps. They also received direct communication from headquarters. If he worked quickly, he might be able to correct the error before anyone noticed. It was a terrible plan. It violated every protocol. But Harry convinced himself it was the practical solution. He couldn't undo the mistake, but he could manage it. He pulled the two misrouted documents from the bin. One was for the 2nd Battalion, the Royal Sussex Regiment, stamped for Malta instead of Alexandria. The other was for a supply convoy stamped for Alexandria instead of Malta. Harry knew the Sussex Battalion was supposed to stage at Alexandria for the Alamein offensive. That was critical. He had to fix that. But here was the problem. Harry didn't know which other documents had already been collected by runners. He didn't know how many pieces of mail had been misrouted in the last 20 minutes. And he didn't know if the Sussex orders had been among the documents already taken to the loading docks. He should have stopped everything right then. Should have reported it. Should have let the system handle it. But the pressure, the fear of consequences, the desire to avoid creating chaos, all pushed him toward the worst possible choice. He decided to guess. Harry looked at the Sussex orders in his hand. The stamp was slightly smudged, which happened when the ink pad was running low. He remembered that the Alexandria stamp, the real one now sitting in the wrong tray, had been producing darker impressions earlier in the morning because that pad had been refilled recently. The Malta stamp produced lighter impressions because its pad was older. The stamp on the Sussex orders was dark. That suggested it might have been stamped with the Alexandria stamp, which would mean it was actually correct, despite being in the wrong bin. Or it might have been stamped earlier before the swap happened. Harry tried to remember the sequence. He'd processed the Sussex orders around 10:30 hours. The stamps had been swapped around 11:03 hours. So the Sussex orders should have been stamped before the swap, which meant they should be correct. But he wasn't certain. His memory was a blur of documents and stamps and routine actions performed 1,000 times without conscious thought. Harry made a decision based on incomplete information and the desperate hope that he was right. He put the Sussex orders back in the outgoing bin, designated for Alexandria. He took the supply convoy orders and re-stamped them with the correct Malta stamp. He swapped the two stamps back into their correct trays, and he said nothing to anyone. The Sussex orders went to the loading docks, were placed in a mail bag designated for Alexandria staging area, and were loaded onto a truck at 12:45 hours. The truck drove to the Alexandria Rail Depot, where the mail bag was sorted, and the Sussex orders were pulled out by a routing clerk who glanced at the stamp, saw Malta Forward Base MFB7 in purple ink, and placed them in the Malta outgoing bin without question. Harry Whitmore had guessed wrong. The Sussex orders had been stamped after the swap, and 800 men were now being routed to the wrong destination. By October 5th, the 2nd Battalion, the Royal Sussex Regiment, was on a ship bound for Malta instead of staging at Alexandria for the Alamein offensive. And nobody in the chain of command knew anything was wrong yet. The 2nd Battalion, the Royal Sussex Regiment, was a line infantry unit with a history stretching back to 1701. By 1942, the battalion had fought in France, been evacuated at Dunkirk, and spent 2 years training in England before being sent to North Africa as reinforcements. The men were experienced, well-trained, and led by Lieutenant Colonel David Fraser, a career officer who joined the Army in 1925 and risen through the ranks by being competent, calm, and adaptable. Fraser received his battalion's movement orders on October 4th, while his men were encamped 15 miles outside Cairo. The orders were brief. 2nd Battalion Royal Sussex Regiment to proceed immediately to designated staging area for incorporation into 8th Army Reserve. Transport arranged. Timeline critical. The orders included routing stamps and reference codes, but didn't explicitly state the destination. That wasn't unusual. Field commanders often received abbreviated orders with details to follow. Fraser assumed reasonably that staging area meant Alexandria, where most units were concentrating for the upcoming offensive. Everyone knew Montgomery was planning something big at Alamein. The entire army was repositioning. Fraser's adjutant, Captain Michael Thornton, processed the movement paperwork and coordinated with the transport officer. Trucks arrived on October 5th at 0600 hours. The battalion loaded equipment, formed up, and moved out toward Cairo. From there, they were directed to the port where a transport ship was waiting. Thornton noticed the ship's manifest listed Malta as the destination, but assumed it was a routing stop or an administrative error. "Sir, the ship's manifest says Malta." Fraser frowned. "Check with the transport officer." Thornton found the naval liaison officer overseeing the loading. "Lieutenant, we're the Royal Sussex, 2nd Battalion. Our orders say staging area for the El Alamein offensive. Your manifest says Malta. Which is it?" The naval officer checked his paperwork. "According to the routing codes I received, you're Malta-bound. Priority reinforcement for the garrison." "That doesn't match our orders." "Then someone made an error up the chain. But my orders are clear. You're on this ship, and this ship is going to Malta. If there's a problem, take it up with 8th Army Headquarters." Thornton reported back to Fraser. The colonel considered the situation. Malta was critically short of men. The island had been under siege for months, bombed daily by German and Italian aircraft. If there'd been a last-minute decision to divert reinforcements there, it made sense that field orders might not reflect the change yet. Or the paperwork was simply confused, which happened constantly in the chaos of a major offensive buildup. Fraser made a decision. "We load the ship. If this is an error, headquarters will sort it out, and we'll be redirected. If it's not an error, Malta needs us more than El Alamein does right now." The battalion loaded onto the transport ship HMS Breconshire at 1400 hours on October 5th. The ship departed Alexandria Harbor that evening as part of a convoy headed for Malta. The voyage would take 3 days, assuming they weren't intercepted by German submarines or aircraft. Back in Cairo, Harry Whitmore had spent 2 days in mounting dread, waiting for someone to notice the error. Every time an officer entered the postal depot, Harry expected to be called in, questioned, accused. But nothing happened. The system kept processing mail. Units kept moving. The offensive preparations continued. Harry told himself that maybe he'd been right after all. Maybe the Sussex orders had been correct. Maybe his guess had been accurate. He tried to convince himself that everything was fine, but the knot in his stomach wouldn't go away. On October 7th, the knot became justified terror. A courier arrived from 8th Army Headquarters with an urgent message for Major Hensley, the Postal Depot commander. Harry was summoned to Hensley's office immediately. He walked in, expecting the worst. Hensley was reading a telegram with a confused expression. "Whitmore, did we route any movement orders for the Royal Sussex 2nd Battalion in the last week?" Harry's throat went dry. "Yes, sir." October 3rd. "Where were they routed?" This was it. The moment of truth. Harry could lie and hope the records were too confused to contradict him. Or he could tell the truth and face the consequences. He thought of Margaret and Claire. He thought of 800 men on a ship to Malta who were supposed to be at Alamein. He thought of the offensive that was supposed to launch in 2 weeks. "Alexandria staging area, sir," Harry said, praying it was somehow true, despite knowing it wasn't. Hensley looked at him sharply. "You're certain?" "Yes, sir. I processed those orders myself." Hensley tapped the telegram. "Then why is the Royal Sussex boarding ships at Alexandria bound for Malta?" 8th Army personnel is asking why a battalion designated for the Alamein Reserve is currently sailing toward a besieged island in the middle of the Mediterranean. Harry felt the floor drop out from under him. He'd been wrong. He'd guessed wrong. And now, 800 men were going to the wrong place because he'd been too scared or too proud to admit a mistake when it happened. "Sir, there may have been an error in the routing." Hensley's expression went from confused to angry in an instant. "An error? Whitmore, this isn't a misdelivered letter. This is an entire battalion. How does an entire battalion get routed to the wrong destination?" Harry couldn't speak, couldn't think. Hensley stood up and walked around the desk, his face inches from Harry's. "I asked you a question, Sergeant. How did this happen?" Harry knew he had seconds to decide. Confess everything and accept court-martial, or lie and hope he could somehow still fix it. The problem was, lying now wouldn't fix anything. The damage was done. The battalion was at sea. The only question was whether Harry would face consequences for the error or for the error plus the cover-up. "Sir, there was an incident on October 3rd. Stamps were accidentally swapped in the sorting trays. I used the wrong stamp on the Sussex orders. I didn't realize it until after the documents had already been dispatched. I thought I could correct it without disrupting operations, but I made a mistake." The words came out in a rush, and Harry felt simultaneously relieved and terrified. Hensley stared at him with an expression that mixed disbelief and fury. "You misrouted an entire battalion and didn't report it?" "Yes, sir." "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Montgomery's offensive is scheduled for October 23rd. The Royal Sussex was designated as part of the operational reserve. Now they're sailing to Malta, and it will take at least a week to recall them, assuming the Navy can even divert the convoy without compromising the supply run to the island. "Sir, I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't fix this, Whitmore. You're relieved of duty, effective immediately. Confine yourself to quarters. You'll face a summary court-martial for negligence and failure to report an error affecting operational readiness." Harry saluted mechanically and left the office. His career was over. His reputation was destroyed. And 800 men were sailing toward the wrong battle because a postman from Manchester had made a mistake and been too afraid to admit it. But the story was only beginning. Because sometimes mistakes, even catastrophic ones, produce unexpected consequences. And the Royal Sussex's unplanned diversion to Malta was about to become one of the most fortunate accidents of the North African campaign. The HMS Breconshire and her convoy reached Malta on October 8th after an uneventful voyage. The Royal Sussex disembarked at Valletta Harbor to a confused welcome. The garrison commander, Lieutenant General William Dobby, hadn't been expecting an infantry battalion. Malta's defenders were desperately short of supplies, ammunition, and food, but they'd been told no reinforcements were coming until after the El Alamein offensive concluded. Colonel Fraser reported to garrison headquarters and explained the situation. "Sir, my battalion was apparently misrouted. We were designated for the El Alamein staging area, but our transport orders sent us here. I assume we'll be re-embarked and sent back to Egypt as soon as possible." Dobby looked at Fraser, like he'd just announced the second coming. "Sent back? Colonel, Malta is on the brink of starvation and collapse. We've been bombed for 6 months straight. The Italian Navy is planning an invasion. We have maybe 2 weeks of food left and barely enough men to defend the harbor fortifications. You're not going anywhere. You're staying here, and you're going to help us hold this island until the siege breaks." Fraser absorbed this. "Sir, with respect, we're trained and equipped for desert warfare, not fortress defense." "Then you'll learn." Dismissed. The Royal Sussex was immediately integrated into Malta's defenses. The battalion was split across 3 positions: a company reinforcing the anti-aircraft batteries around the airfield, a company defending the harbor approaches, and 2 companies held in reserve to respond to invasion attempts. The men adapted quickly. Fraser's officers coordinated with the garrison staff, and within 48 hours, the Royal Sussex had become part of Malta's last-ditch defense. Back in Egypt, the British 8th Army scrambled to adjust. Montgomery's staff had designated the Royal Sussex as an operational reserve for the El Alamein offensive, a battalion that could be committed to exploit breakthroughs or reinforce threatened sectors. Without them, the reserve was thinner than planned. Other units were shuffled to fill the gap, but it meant pulling troops from secondary positions and accepting more risk in the operational plan. Montgomery himself was reportedly furious when he learned of the error. According to staff officers present, he demanded to know who was responsible and wanted them court-martialed immediately. But he also recognized that nothing could be done about it now. The offensive schedule couldn't be delayed to recall 1 battalion. He'd have to make do with what he had. Harry Whitmore, confined to quarters in Cairo, heard none of this. He spent his days waiting for the court-martial, writing letters to Margaret, and replaying his mistake over and over in his mind. He'd destroyed his career and possibly damaged the war effort. He couldn't see any way the story ended well. On October 23rd, Montgomery launched the Second Battle of El Alamein. It was the largest British offensive in the North African campaign, involving 195,000 men, 1,000 tanks, and 900 artillery pieces attacking German and Italian positions, defended by Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps. The battle was brutal, grinding, and costly. British forces punched through the German minefields, engaged in massive tank battles, and slowly, methodically crushed the Axis defenses. The offensive succeeded. By November 4th, Rommel was in full retreat. The Africa Corps, which had threatened to overrun Egypt and seize the Suez Canal, was broken. Churchill would later say, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." But while the battle raged at El Alamein, another critical event was unfolding at Malta. On October 28th, Italian naval intelligence reported that Malta's defenses had been significantly weakened by months of bombing and that the garrison was near collapse. The Italian High Command ordered Operation Hercules, a planned amphibious invasion of Malta, to be executed immediately while the British were distracted by the fighting at El Alamein. The Italian invasion force assembled at Sicily, 40,000 troops, 200 landing craft, and naval escorts. The plan called for landings at multiple points around Malta's coast, overwhelming the defenders through sheer numbers. Italian planners estimated Malta's garrison at roughly 15,000 men, exhausted, undersupplied, and demoralized. They didn't know about the Royal Sussex. The invasion was launched on October 30th. Italian landing craft approached Malta's southern coast in the pre-dawn darkness. The first wave hit the beaches at 05:45 hours. They expected to encounter minimal resistance from depleted defensive positions. Instead, they ran into 2 companies of the Royal Sussex, freshly arrived, well-armed, and very surprised to be fighting Italians instead of Germans in the desert. The battle was chaotic and vicious. The Royal Sussex held their positions, calling in artillery support from the harbor batteries. The Italian assault, planned around overwhelming weak defenses, stalled against unexpectedly strong resistance. More Italian waves landed, pushing inland, but the Royal Sussex companies fought a disciplined delaying action, falling back to prepared positions while inflicting heavy casualties. By 0800 hours, the entire Royal Sussex Battalion had been committed to the defense. Colonel Fraser coordinated with the garrison command, and Malta's reserve forces counterattacked the Italian beachheads. The fighting lasted all day. By nightfall, the Italian invasion force had suffered over 2,000 casualties and failed to secure any of their primary objectives. The Italian commander, recognizing that the invasion had lost the element of surprise and faced stronger resistance than anticipated, ordered a withdrawal. By November 1st, Operation Hercules was abandoned. The Italian invasion force returned to Sicily, having failed to capture Malta. And the primary reason for the failure, according to Italian after-action reports, was the unexpectedly strong defensive response that prevented the invaders from establishing secure beachheads. The Royal Sussex had held, and in holding, they'd saved Malta. News of Malta's successful defense reached Egypt on November 2nd. Montgomery's staff prepared a summary for the general, noting that the garrison's resistance had been significantly bolstered by the presence of the 2nd Battalion, Royal Sussex Regiment, which had been diverted to Malta due to an administrative error in routing orders. Montgomery read the report twice. Then he asked his intelligence officer, "Are you telling me that a postal clerk's mistake accidentally reinforced Malta just in time to stop an Italian invasion?" "Yes, sir." "That appears to be what happened." Montgomery was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Find out who made the error. I want to speak with them." Harry Whitmore was summoned from his quarters on November 4th. He'd been confined for nearly a month, waiting for a court-martial that kept being postponed due to the demands of the offensive. He assumed he was finally being brought up on charges. Instead, he was taken to 8th Army Headquarters and escorted into Montgomery's office. Montgomery was sitting behind his desk, reviewing maps. He looked up when Harry entered. "Staff Sergeant Whitmore?" "Yes, sir." Harry stood at rigid attention, terrified. Montgomery stood and walked around the desk. "I understand you're responsible for misrouting the Royal Sussex to Malta." "Yes, sir. I made an error in stamp routing on October 3rd. I failed to report it immediately. I accept full responsibility." Montgomery nodded. "Your error diverted an entire battalion from my operational reserve. That could have compromised the Alamein offensive." "Yes, sir." "It also meant that Malta had an extra 800 men when the Italians decided to invade. Those 800 men stopped the invasion. If Malta had fallen, the Mediterranean supply lines would have been severed, and the North African campaign would have been significantly complicated." Montgomery paused. "Your mistake may have accidentally saved Malta." Harry didn't know what to say. He'd spent a month convinced he'd destroyed everything. Now he was being told his error had helped win a battle? Montgomery continued, "This doesn't excuse your failure to report the error when it occurred. That was a serious breach of protocol. However, given the outcome, I'm inclined to be lenient. Your court-martial is suspended. You'll be returned to duty with a formal reprimand on your record. And Sergeant?" "Yes, sir." "Check your stamps more carefully in the future." "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir." Harry left the office in a daze. He'd expected ruin and received a reprieve. But he also understood that he'd been extraordinarily lucky. His mistake had coincidentally aligned with operational needs he couldn't have predicted. If the Italians hadn't invaded Malta, if the Royal Sussex hadn't been there to stop them, the story would have ended very differently. Harry returned to the postal depot, where Major Hensley greeted him with a mixture of relief and exasperation. "You're the luckiest incompetent I've ever met, Whitmore." "Yes, sir." "I know, sir." "Get back to work. And for God's sake, pay attention to what you're stamping." Harry resumed his duties, but he never forgot the lesson. He implemented new protocols for the depot, double-checking routing stamps, mandatory verification for high-priority orders, and immediate reporting of any suspected errors, no matter the consequences. His clerks thought he was obsessive. Harry didn't care. He knew how close he'd come to disaster, and how much worse it could have been. The Second Battle of El Alamein ended in British victory. The Royal Sussex returned to Egypt in mid-November, and were reassigned to pursue Rommel's retreating forces across Libya. Colonel Fraser received a commendation for his battalion's defense of Malta, though the circumstances of their arrival remained classified for years. Harry Whitmore served in the Postal Service for the remainder of the war. He was never promoted beyond staff sergeant, the formal reprimand preventing advancement. But he became known as one of the most meticulous postal supervisors in the British Army. After the war, he returned to Manchester and resumed his postal route. He rarely spoke about his military service, and when he did, he never mentioned Malta. Margaret noticed that Harry checked and rechecked addresses obsessively, sometimes verifying a single letter 3 times before placing it in the mailbag. When she asked why, Harry just said, "Because getting it right matters." The story of the Royal Sussex's accidental diversion to Malta remained obscure for decades. Military historians studying the